Welcome to the Light and Shadow podcast. I am Grey, quantum-informed, spiritual mentor, founder of the Grey Ethereus Academy, and creator of the Alchemical Pattern-to-Healing Framework. I work at the threshold where insight alone stops working and real transformation begins. This is a space for the spiritually aware who are ready to go deeper than healing has taken them. Today's conversation is about evolution. Not as metaphor, not as spiritual platitude, but as the actual mechanism unfolding beneath the chaos of our time. We're talking about money as a consciousness technology, systems built to concentrate power, and the question of whether humanity is capable of the shift required to navigate what comes next. My guest is Scott Paradis, a retired U.S. Army colonel, former Congressional Fellow in the U.S. Senate, and former National Security Fellow at Harvard University. Over a 30-year military career, Scott served in leadership roles across Europe, the Middle East, and Washington, D.C. He is the author of 11 books on leadership, money, and human potential, and the creator of What is Really Going On? Apocalypse or Evolution. What sets Scott apart is his refusal to choose between the mystical and the mechanical. His work reveals how money, power, and consciousness shape our lives, not as separate forces, but as interlocking systems. And he argues that what we are experiencing is not a collapse, it is evolution. A shattering of old forms to make space for something new, but only if we choose it. What I appreciate about Scott's work is that he doesn't hand-wave the difficulty. He spent decades inside the machinery of power, military, political, academic, and learned how systems actually function, how they concentrate control, and how they disempower ordinary people. Now he teaches how to see those systems clearly and how to operate with agency inside them. Before we start, I want to say this. Some of you listening may feel like the world is coming apart. Some of you may be exhausted by spiritual optimism that ignores reality. Some of you may be navigating the gap between inner transformation and outer systems that don't not change. All of those experiences are welcome here. This conversation isn't about reassurance. It is about clarity. Scott, welcome to the Light and Shadow podcast.
Thanks for having me, Grey.
Scott, you argue we are experiencing evolution, not collapse. But from inside the chrysalis, how does someone distinguish between necessary dissolution and actual disintegration?
That's a great question, because we're all faced with exactly that question. Is it just all happening to us, or are we creating this reality? And how do we discern where it is, in fact, we're going? One of the challenges for us, really, fundamentally, is what are our foundational beliefs, which create in tandem, collectively, a worldview. So we want to answer fundamentally two questions, and we do this as we approach life. One question is, am I more concerned about what I can measure or prove, or am I more concerned about what I experience and feel? So that's just one question we have to answer. The other question is what I see or experience through my five senses all there is, or is there something more to that? Now, there are 8,000 people on this planet. There are 8,000 worldviews and perspectives, but I say they can be narrowed down to three different perspectives. The overriding perspective, most people just involved in everyday life, getting on with getting on, are focused on making things happen, maybe making money, establishing a lifestyle, and so forth. So they don't give a lot of thought to the big picture, so to speak, and I would say they're in a survivalist worldview. That is, traditionally, the survivalist worldview is a might makes right. That might makes right perspective is it's a dog eat dog, survival of the fittest world.
Right.
I'm just going to compete to at least stay up with everyone else, or if I can, to move beyond everyone else. So I would say that's most people's perspective. This sort of survivalist, whatever I'm presented with, I will just deal with. There is a second perspective. And I would say if you took a survey, most people would say they would conform to this worldview of what I call the theist worldview. The theist worldview is God has created us and now is watching how we perform. And for many people, this life is a test. So
Yeah.
I'm here, I was put here by a creator, and now I have to pass the test. What that does is someone else is responsible, someone else has control of the big plan, and now it's up to me to figure out the rules of the game and conform so I can pass the test. Then I would
Right.
say there's a third worldview, which is what I call a holist worldview,
Okay.
which is we are an integrated part of the whole, and we are collectively creating the reality we experience. So it has very different implications for answering that question. If you're a survivalist, it's all about how do I get through today? How do I compete better? How do I secure more for myself and my family? If you're a theist, how do I play by the rules that God has established so that I can pass that test? If you're a holist, it's I'm responsible for what I'm creating, and I'm responsible for where I go next.
Right.
And that brings us to this sort of present moment, that we're all in. And I say there are about 5 factors that influence this current moment that are different from what we've experienced before. First of all, we have environmental upheaval, and some would say, you could say climate change as a component of that, but larger storms, earthquakes, volcanoes, all of those things that are happening around the world that seem to be intensifying. I would say that's the planet sending us a message that we need to re-examine or examine the way we've been approaching our lives and maybe reorient. But now from a social perspective, we have economic stratification, which has now gone to the extreme. And this is, you brought up the idea of money. So that's a big component of what I like to talk about, is this idea of money and wealth and this rat race we create for ourselves. This economic stratification has put concentrated wealth and power into the hands of a few, and the masses have, in relative terms, very little. And our systems perpetuate this cycle. So we have
Right.
economic stratification taken to an extreme right now.
Right.
The third factor is political polarization.
Okay.
So now we have these divisions within society. It's we, they, us and them, us against the world, whatever it may be. But it is deliberate and it's division by design. It's causing us to split. It's been used, this tactic has been used throughout human history by people who want to seize power. You divide the masses, and then that way the few can seize power. But we have political polarization taken to an extreme. The fourth factor, I would say, is this technological disruption.
Yeah.
Today we're seeing what the issue of the day, so to speak, or the technology of the day is artificial intelligence. So we see artificial intelligence coming at us like a freight train. We compound that with our cell phones and all the other technology that we're exposed to. It is a disruptor, seemingly accelerating our lives for the good and for the bad. But then all of those, so those 4 factors, combined with us living our own lives. And then we all face challenges and loss and all the things that come with being alive in this time-space reality.
Right.
So those factors are all peaking. The confluence of events is creating this chaos and turmoil we have never experienced in our lifetimes.
Right. Right.
So that is causing us to first assess what's going on, what's really going on. Is this the end? So under the survivalist perspective, it's just, we've hit a rough patch. We've hit a rough patch. We're going to adapt. We're going to overcome. We're going to muddle through. And that's sort of the another day, just another dollar, just keep stepping forward. And that makes sense if your perspective is only what I see is all there is.
Right.
From the theist perspective, well, God, this is God's plan playing out. And you see this in a lot of headlines these days about the wars that are going on and the conflicts that are arising, that this is the biblical end times, that we are reaching a culminating event, that God, again, this is the end of the battle between good and evil and all of that coming to a head that we're experiencing right now.
Right.
I would go beyond that and say that this is really a test for each of us individually. So you look at all the turmoil and the chaos that's going on with all of those factors, and they combine to force us, each of us, to the breaking point, or what I call a decision point. And the decision point is, am I going to stay with the old way, the old modicum of doing things, the might makes right, dog eat dog, compete, get ahead as much as I can, the old way that we've been repeating this cycle for 12,000 years. This has been our way of getting along or not getting along as a society. Or am I going to make a different choice? And that different choice is to connect, collaborate, and create so that we can all prosper.
So basically, the difference is directionality. Collapse fragments without rebuilding. Evolution breaks down in service of something emerging. So, but you have to be able to hold both the breaking and the building simultaneously. And Scott, when you say this is an evolutionary moment, what specifically is evolving? Is it our economic systems, our consciousness, our capacity for collective coordination, or is it totally something else?
No, I think it's all of those things. It's the foundation is our consciousness. So the question is, each of us have to make a decision, have to choose. Which way am I going? Am I going to stick with the old, which is that competitive nature, which we've seen over and over again, which leads to pain and suffering, death and destruction, all of those things? Or am I going to make a better choice? Am I going to resonate at a higher frequency, so to speak? Am I going to fundamentally change direction? It becomes a consciousness choice. So it's a conscious choice of consciousness. And if our consciousness evolves, collectively, then the reality we experience evolves, which then changes the systems, our abilities to connect and collaborate and create together. It will fundamentally shift the incentives that we have designed to support the old way, the old competitive way.
That is critical. And because if consciousness evolves but systems stay extractive, we just have more aware people trapped in the same cage. The inner and outer have to move together. And also, you say money is not wealth. I agree. It is a tool that organizes a human effort. How does misunderstanding this distinction keep people trapped?
Part of the challenge, first of all, money is just a social construct.
Yeah.
It's just an idea that we've all bought into. And it is a tool to help us. So I say there are two types, two games that we are playing, two money games. One of those is a making game, which is the foundational economy. When you ask most people, they would say they're playing a making game, and I'll explain this to you. It is this idea that I create something of value or collect or bring something of value to a marketplace, and then I exchange that value. This is the making game or the making economy. This is what we call Main Street economy, the real economy. That is, you create something of value, you bring it to the marketplace, and then you exchange that value. That's the making game. We use money to facilitate the exchange, to overcome the disparity of wants. We use something we call money, which has evolved from many different things. Today, it's a fiat currency. It's what we call the dollar in the United States is issued by the federal government that we all agree to as medium of exchange, unit of value, and store of wealth to exchange real value. But now what happens is, as we decide that something is money, because we're always focused on this, human nature has this competitive element to it, we realize that once everyone buys into this thing is money and this money can get us value, we focus, instead of bringing value to the marketplace, on getting money so that we can get what we want.
Right.
Now, this goes back to your point about these extractive systems. If your intention is to elevate yourself above others, to dominate others, to oppress others, then you are going to seek a position that everyone else wants. And what that is for us these days, since we have elevated money, we have empowered money, is to get money. But money itself is just a construct. It's just a tool. And it's a tool that allocates human effort.
So people chase the symbol instead of what the symbol represents. And the system profits from that confusion, because if you understood money clearly, you would stop participating in extraction. And you described the two games, the making a game, the creating the value, and the taking game, which is extracting the value. Now, based on what you just said, I want to know, how do these games operate simultaneously, and why does the taking game keep winning till now?
Because I think most people have this idea of fairness and cooperation, the human values and morality that most people have, that they have built over their lifetimes, is I'm going to play a fair game, I'm going to contribute, I'm going to bring value. So that's just how they operate in their daily lives. However, there are some people who are built a little differently, and they are looking for a competitive edge. And this has happened over and over. You look through human history for 12,000 years, this has happened over and over and over again.
Yes.
Those individuals realize that the closer I get to, let's say, government or institutions or people in power, then I can start to skew the rules of the game to my favor. So what we have is the people who are playing the making game think we're on a level playing field. That's not the case. We, over years, decades, centuries, have tilted the game in favor of those who are playing by taking rules as opposed to making rules. And since we all believe that money is that pinnacle of how we get what we want, we all default to money having power. It's that we empower the money, not that money in and of itself is powerful. But what happens is those competitive folks always eventually gain the edge, and the other folks who are just trying to play by the making rules, that is, I'm going to create some value, I'm going to go to a job, I'm going to work my hours, I'm going to contribute. Then what ends up happening is, in the United States, it's a financialized economy, which financialization is equated to ownership. And ownership is how we allocate who owes and who owns. Then we institutionalize it through laws and all the enforcement mechanisms of police and Department of Justice and all of these things that institutionalize that ownership is the key. So you're trying to get money so you can ultimately own stuff, which then gives you power. And because you have money and people want money, you fundamentally get power just by having money. And it's all because we have agreed to this. We have agreed to this game, the making game, and then the taking game that overlays it. So people who are just trying to play the making game fairly, they're always getting things extracted from them that they don't understand. How can I not get ahead? How can I not get ahead? It's because this taking game overlays the making game, and you're always trying to play catch up.
Right, and because the taking game wrote the rules, it controls the levels of power, the legislation, the finance, the media. The making game creates, the taking game captures. And most people do not even know that there are two games. And you have said that the economic system is not failing. It is working exactly as designed. So what do you mean by that? And what does that imply about our agency within it?
Yes. The two parts to that. First is this idea of tilting the field is deliberate and conscious, and we've allowed it to happen and been overwhelmed by it happening because we give our agency away. So the challenge is we've got to recognize, first of all, that there are two games being played. And if we're serious about this, we've got to collectively come to terms with leveling the playing field. So first thing is, agency is a component of accepting responsibility. So in other words, I've been playing this game, if I'm talking just strictly from the money game perspective, I've been playing this game and not realizing there is a taking game that has been extracting from me. So first I've got to realize that I've been complicit in this game playing. That's how I get my agency back. The second thing is now I've got to take action that I'm going to disassociate myself as best I can from those extracting, and I'm going to associate with those creating value and bringing value to the marketplace. And I'm going to line up my life to support others who do the same thing. In this way, we can mutually reinforce each other and we can collectively take our agency back, which then means we can adjust the systems. The challenge we face is the system now has been designed with incentives that create outcomes. And these outcomes lead back to that economic stratification that I talked about. It's deliberate, it's by design. And that's why I say our system is functioning as designed. It is to advantage a few at the expense of the many.
Right, right. So basically, the system concentrates power efficiently. It's not broken. It's functioning perfectly for those it was built to serve, which means reform will not work. You need a different operating system entirely. So Scott, is a humanity addicted to fear as an organizing principle? And if so, what replaces it without collapsing into naive optimism?
Yes. That is the million-dollar question, so to speak. And I would say this is that point of decision, going back to where we began on this idea of raising our consciousness.
Yeah.
It really is, am I going to buy into fear? We've had
Yeah.
12,000 years of buying into fear over and over and over again and creating these systems that then ultimately lead to collapse. We concentrate wealth and power. The hierarchy gets built. It's much like the Tower of Babel. We just build taller and taller and taller until eventually it collapses. And we've done that over and over and over again. And I think the foundational point is the one you raise. It's because I hate to use the word addicted. It's like we can't break ourselves away from it, but we continue to choose fear as opposed to something better, which the opposite of that, I would say, is love. And love ultimately is discerning, deciding, realizing we are not what we think we are. We are, in fact, elements of the whole, these divine beings having this experience in time and space. If we realize that, if we truly accept that as true, then we can finally let fear go.
Right.
And once we let fear go, we can chart a new course, change those systems fundamentally.
Yeah, that is the test. You can't just remove fear and hope love fills the gap. You need a different evolutionary driver. For example, curiosity, responsibility, interdependence, something structurally that is sound. You talk about unveiling. What specific illusions are being exposed right now that people are most resisting to seeing?
I think first it starts with that foundation of fear. So the folks in power, so that extractive system, they are deliberately using fear and hate to divide and separate people.
Yeah.
Now, one of the challenges, and I thought about this as we got to this point of this maximum chaos and turmoil, and it's continuing to build, maximum chaos and turmoil. Why aren't leaders coming forth and saying, stop, this is all craziness, this is madness? And the answer that I have arrived at is back to this point of this chaos and turmoil is pushing each of us to that breaking point or decision point where we each individually have to make that choice. Am I going to choose the old way, which is a fear-based paradigm of
Right.
seeing this reality, or am I going to choose a better way of, to your point, that idea of responsibility, interconnectedness, ultimately this idea of love?
Yeah.
Am I going, which way am I going to go? So there is no one in a white hat coming to save us, because we
Right.
each individually have to make that choice.
Right.
And
Right.
once we make the choice, once I make a choice, am I going to stick with the old way? I'm going to ride this train to the end.
Yeah.
Well, then I'm in a competitive environment where it's going to be a struggle, but I understand that. Maybe I have the skills to compete well, but that's the way I like it. I'm not going to put a good and bad label on it. I'm just choosing a different experience. But what I would say is we have a growth experience, an opportunity to choose something different than we've experienced for 12,000 years, which is this other choice of
Yeah.
connecting with people, collaborating with people, letting fear go, building
Yeah.
a system that actually levels the playing field so that we can create giant economic and political systems that are very different from the incentives that we've had so far. And it really is a conscious breaking, so to speak, a separation of the way things were from the potential that we actually can experience.
Right. So the resistance is actually the signal. The harder someone defends an illusion, the more foundational it is to their identity, and losing it feels like death. So, which leads me to this question. Can personal awakening, I'm not talking about collective, can personal awakening actually shift systems? Or is that spiritual bypassing dressed as activism?
And here's where you and I and any of your listeners have to determine what's the truth.
Yeah.
Because if you dissect that question and say, this is a single dimensional world, that everything can be verified physically, I can prove it, I can measure it. If I can't prove it and measure it, then it doesn't exist. It's one dimension. Then it goes back to, I think, exactly your point. Then it has to fall in line with the incentives of the world, which is a survival of the fittest and all of those things. However, if you have a different perspective, and it goes back to that worldview that I introduced, and that is either the theist worldview that there are at least two dimensions. One is the physical, the second is a spiritual. And I just say that cleanly to say two dimensions. Or if you're a holist and you say there's the physical, then there are other dimensions, which could be up to infinity level of dimensions. If you operate in either of those spaces, then you leave room for this idea of your choice being a personal leap to a new resonance, to a new frequency, if you want to use that word, to a new way of approaching this reality. So the individual evolution or conscious decision to try to operate, or to in fact operate at a higher level, is in fact going to change the reality that you experience. So if I decide there's only one dimension and I've got to be verified, then I'm in this ground truth struggle of fear, and I'm going to cling to fear, cling to what I know.
Yeah.
If I can, as you said, to let go of that illusion, feels like death. If I can bring myself to at least loosen my grip, then I'm going to start to see some things differently. And if I can actually let it go completely and say, I am going to open myself to the opportunities before me, allow what happens to happen, accept that what has happened, and again, rejoice because this is a magnificent adventure, then you will change your habits, change your worldview ultimately, and then evolve to a higher level. And I would say this is not something that is, it happens in an instant when you can make that decision, but it's usually an evolution of I've got to let go of all of those old challenges, break that illusion. And I think that's why we see the turmoil growing so immensely, is because the chaos and turmoil are pushing us and pushing us and pushing us to the point where it seems so overwhelming. I've got to let go. I've either got to decide I'm going to hide in fear, cling, and hold on to all the things that have been, or I'm going to let go and open myself to the possibility that can be.
Exactly. I love that. Scott, after 30 years in the Army, Congress, and Harvard, what did you learn about how power actually operates that most people never see?
I think one of the key things, and the point of a military career is all about how we apply power to achieve political goals. And unfortunately, it ultimately can go to an extreme of physical violence, but it's all in this application of power. And working on Capitol Hill, seeing how the US government operates, or at Harvard, studying how the world functions collectively from this political economic standpoint, I would say the key thing, two key points. One is it is really our collective consciousness in a practical way that designs, develops, and supports these systems, which are all driven by incentives, and they're designed that way. But those systems are built by human beings, individual human beings coming together, and they come together through relationship. So when I first went on Capitol Hill, one of the first went to go see a senator, visit a senator, and we were talking about something or other, and we were talking about some legislation, and they wanted to know who else was on board, who else was on board the legislation. It wasn't about what the legislation accomplished, it was who else was supporting it. The relationship became first. That was the key thing. And it is all ultimately life, this experience of life, this joy of life and this challenge of life is all about relationships. Power is a fundamental component of that. It is, we individually are immensely powerful. And when we come together in relationship, we multiply that capability exponentially.
Yes, 100%. Power usually is not loud or obvious. It is embedded in assumptions and who gets to frame the question and what considered realistic. Real power shapes the field before the game even starts. So, Scott, what does it actually mean to stay centered in a world that feels off its axis, not as a platitude, but as a practice?
I think part of it, and I go back to that sort of mantra that I open, allow, accept, rejoice. It is this idea, okay, I'm not without fear. And I'm trying to move in the direction so that I can relegate fear to the appropriate place in my life. But for me, what that means is if I feel fear, it is not to just jump into the emotion of it and react. It is to recognize I'm feeling fear as a signal. When I look at the headlines, if I watch the news or I see something happening, there is a tendency to react to that emotion that's flowing toward me, and I experience it in my body as fear. What I have to do is then realize, wait a minute, I'm feeling fear. That's a signal. That is a signal for me to potentially examine something that is holding me back.
Yeah.
If I can do that, if I can recognize the fear, not react because of the fear, but recognize the fear, doesn't mean I'm going to be without fear, but I'm going to live in a way that lets that fear flow. It flows through me. I understand how it feels, but I'm not going to react based on the fear. Right. I'm going to center myself in what I believe the truth is.
So basically, it's you need to be grounded. You need to embody. You need to be specific, not to stay positive, but where you place your attention, how you spend your time, what you refuse to participate in. Agency at the micro level. So we know that evolution is possible, and fear is what stops people from choosing that evolution. But can it be as well familiarity, which is the comfort zone, and identity attachment?
That is, I think, and that goes back to me, goes back to your fundamental point of this idea of ego attaching to something and making that break or letting it go is the fundamental challenge that we have to face. And it comes back to, okay, am I responsible for my life, or are external events responsible for my life, or other people responsible for my life? If I can come to the terms that say I'm responsible for my life, people like to say they want to be free. Everybody wants freedom, 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 freedom. The flip side of the coin of freedom is responsibility. You cannot have one without the other. So if you can come to terms with and saying, I'm responsible, then everything I'm clinging to, all that fear that I feel, everything that's holding me back is me. It's me. I've got to let that go. I've got to let that go. And if you can make the leap to realize what you truly are is a divine and powerful being. You are integrated into the whole. If you can accept that, then you can begin to let that fear and all of those ego attachments go. And as you do that, you start to step out into new light. And from that new light, you are empowered, and you can step further and further and further, and it will be a whole new experience of this reality.
Right. So basically, it's all of the above of what we just mentioned, plus the fact that evolution requires letting go of who you have been. And this is mostly people would rather suffer familiarly than transform into the unknown. So you claim the real revolution is personal, not political. So for the listener, what does that look like in someone's day-to-day life without becoming navel-gazing self-improvement?
Part of it is, first of all, I got to realize I'm responsible, and I'm responsible how I approach the circumstances or the situation that I'm in. So the first thing is, I can't change your mind, Gray. I can't change anyone else's mind.
Right.
So it's not neither of us benefit by having an argument about. All we're doing is we're looking at things from different perspectives. So for me, it's realizing other people see things from other perspectives, and I'm not going to try to change their perspective. I'm going to live my life true to myself. It is those small steps. I'm not going to reach some pinnacle of achievement and set myself above everyone else. I am everyone else. I see myself in everyone else. There are just points where some people are holding on to more fear. There are some points where some have let that go better than I have. It is not a competition. It is, I like to say it this way. It's not becoming someone else. It's letting go of all we've been pretending to be.
I love that.
Letting go of what we've been pretending to be.
Yes.
So if I do that little by little, I'm not challenging people. I'm just living my life the best way that I can. And my example, it might not be obvious, but my example in its own little way is an inspiration to others.
Right.
So if I can do something that empowers myself, and then other people see, hey, that person, maybe somebody who doesn't even know me, sees me do something that I did not get overly emotionally involved. I did not get into a fight over this or that. I just accepted that other people see things from other perspectives. That's fine. I'm going to live my life. Now, it comes back to some little things that you could do is associate with people who are moving in the same direction you are, exploring new opportunities in new ways. Get outside your comfort zone in that regard. Make new connections. It's all little steps. It's little steps. Build that little community, that little family of people who are open and accepting, and you yourself will become more open and accepting.
That is a great advice. It's not about optimizing yourself. It is about changing your relationship to power, changing your relationship to money, to consumption, to participation. The personal becomes political when it disrupts the system's assumptions. And I want to ask you, Scott, what happens if humanity collectively refuses this evolutionary invitation? Do we collapse? Do we stagnate or regress?
The historical record shows a lot of destruction. We've been through this cycle before. Typically what happens is, and again, where you opened, is this idea of evolution usually destroys. It's this creative destruction, this idea of we've got to break something for the phoenix to rise. Ultimately, the old ways of thinking will be segregated or separated or fall away to a different reality. But what that means in practical terms for us is if we collectively don't make the decision to evolve, then the system will cause us to fail. Now, does that mean absolute collapse? I struggle with that point because I see, okay, if I don't make this leap personally and move to the evolutionary plane, am I going to experience the challenges of destruction and death and pain and suffering and all of those other things? And will we all experience this collectively? If we do, it comes back to, for me, I don't think this is all there is. I think I am part of a divine whole, and I will then change my perspective to a different plane of observation and say, okay, I did not quite make the leap this time. Maybe I can try again.
Yeah, yeah.
But the person who's on that physical plane, that survivalist plane, that if they hold on to that and that fear and that competition and we don't collectively make the leap, then I think we're going to face more challenges, more turmoil, more destruction.
Right.
I have no proof or anything to suggest that's going to happen, but it just feels like that is
like
the direction.
a pattern. It's like a pattern. You're basically making your analysis based on patterns. So if traditional institutions aren't leading us through this, where do you see genuine leadership emerging at this point?
I think one of the things that and the folks I talk to and the texts that I read and the people I hear from, it's ultimately going to be the people with a powerful sense of compassion. So we tend, in the United States right now, we have this leadership that it's all about power, it's all about might. It's I'm going to force these people to comply to my will. Yes. That's the exact opposite of what genuine leadership is. Genuine leadership is about helping people become the best versions of themselves. So when we see that, the basis for that is compassion and understanding. And see where those people are going to rise to the fore who have this ability to recognize in others their divinity, their capability, their potential, but also realize that they are restricted or limited. They are limiting themselves by fear. So they are going to extend a hand, empathy, compassion, and help to orient them in a different direction. That's where leadership, genuine leadership, is going to emerge. The unfortunate part is maybe it's going to take us to things get worse first before we start to recognize those compassionate leaders and then join in that direction, as opposed to this, I'm going to beat the other guy into submission to conform to my will, because that's the way it's always been done.
Right, right. So what do you see hope in this moment? Not wishful thinking, but real grounded hope.
For me, and part of it is people like you and the work you're doing. I'm seeing this proliferating across the internet or these other spaces where people are reaching out and connecting individual to individual, soul to soul, person to person, in ways that I've never seen before. Now, part of that is this technology is allowing us to do that. So that's the good aspect of this technology. But I see that as hope. There are people who are not engaging in the fight for the purpose of the fight, but they are engaging in building relationships, building a foundation, building a family. Those are the places where hope resonates. So there's always hope. And even in the most difficult of times, even when we had those World War II as an example, or World War I, or other great calamities around the globe, there were pockets of people holding to their values, their moral conviction, their belief, their faith, their hope, because that's the nature of this life. It is a grand adventure that we are all on to learn what we've determined that we need to learn so that we can move on in our spiritual development and return, in my perspective, to the source, to the collective, to that fundamental nature of love.
So hope basically lives in the people who have stopped asking permission and started building alternatives like local economies, regenerative systems, new forms of governance. So this is the difference, because wishful thinking avoids reality and hope sees reality clearly and chooses to act anyway. It is a discipline. It is not a feeling. My last question to you, Scott, is if someone listening begins to see through the system clearly for the first time, what is the very first grounded step they can take to start living differently?
I think the first grounded step, it goes back to this compassion, is not seeing the other as a competitor. It is realizing the other is a different version of you with the same challenges that we all have and that we all face. I'm not walking in their shoes, and I will give them some grace.
Yeah.
If I start to do that and create that I'm going to extend grace as a habit, then it will become something that I internalize, and it will more than just empower your relationships. It will genuinely empower you.
100%. I love that. I love that. It is simple. It is direct. It's not overwhelming. That's where change actually starts. One conscious choice that breaks the pattern. Scott, this has been one of the most honest conversations I've had about what's actually happening beneath the chaos. To everyone listening, I want to leave you with something Scott said. That this moment isn't collapse, it is evolution. But evolution requires choice. It requires letting go of who you have been, what you have believed about how the world works, and the systems you have participated in unconsciously. The illusions are being exposed. The old forms are shattering. And what comes next depends entirely on whether we are willing to see clearly, act responsibly, and build differently. You can find Scott's work at Scott F. Paradis. It's with the S at the end, .com. I will link it in the show box below, including his books on leadership and money and his series, What is Really Going On? Apocalypse or Evolution. That is the name. Available on YouTube and Udemy. He has spent decades inside the machinery of power and now teaches how to understand it, navigate it, and ultimately transcend it. If this conversation brought something up for you, if you're recognizing that you have been operating inside a system you did not choose, or if you're ready to build from unconscious participation to conscious agency, you can learn more about my private coaching and mentorship in the link in the show notes below. If this conversation simply left you with the question, what am I choosing? Then sit with that. Don't rush to answer it. Let it work on you. This is the Light and Shadow Podcast. Thank you for listening with an open mind and a discerning heart. Until next time.